Turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis chapter 45. This is the part of the story where Joseph reveals his true identity. Now, remember, up to this point, Joseph's brothers had no idea who he really was. Yes, they knew he was the vizier of Egypt, but they didn't know that he was Joseph, the brother they had sold into slavery. And up to this point in the story, Joseph had intentionally kept his true identity a secret. But there was a reason why he kept it a secret. He kept it a secret so he could put his brothers through a series of tests without them realizing they were being tested. You know, they wouldn't have reacted normally if they knew it was a test, but they had no idea they were being tested, and that's what Joseph wanted. So Joseph wanted to know if they had changed over the last 22 years or if they were still the same. And as I said last week, they passed all of the tests with flying colors. First of all, they had shown true remorse for what they had done to Joseph. Secondly, they had proven themselves to be honest, God-fearing men who loved their father and respected him. Thirdly, they hadn't shown any resentment when Joseph showed favoritism towards Benjamin. And last but not least, and most importantly, they weren't willing to abandon Benjamin to his own fate to save their own skin. In fact, Judah actually begged Joseph to let him take Benjamin's place. In other words, he was willing to give his own life in place of his brothers for the sake of his father. So Joseph's brothers passed all of the tests with flying colors. Now, before we move on to chapter 45, I want to make sure that everyone understands the significance of these tests. Because if you don't understand the significance of these tests, as you're reading through the Old Testament, certain things don't make sense. Why did God do what he did? So you need to understand the significance of these tests because the book of Genesis devotes a huge section to this story. And it wasn't a story for us to go, oh, that's cute, that's neat. No, there was a purpose for devoting this much material to the story of Joseph. You see, had Joseph's brothers failed these tests in any way, they would have proven themselves unworthy to be the ancestors of God's chosen people. Think about it. God's chosen people could have descended both from Jacob and Esau, but Esau proved himself unworthy to be the ancestor of God's chosen people. So only Jacob was chosen. And had Joseph's brothers proved themselves unworthy as Esau had, then God's chosen people would have descended from Joseph alone or from Joseph and Benjamin. But by passing all of these tests, Joseph's brothers proved themselves worthy to be the ancestors of God's chosen people. And that's why the tribes of Israel bear their names. They are the ancestors of God's chosen people. So our God is known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And his chosen people are from the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Dan, Naphtali, Benjamin, and Manasseh and Ephraim. That's kind of interesting because Manasseh and Ephraim are not the sons of Israel. They are the grandsons of Israel. But they were the two oldest boys of Joseph. And they received Joseph's inheritance because Joseph received the blessing. That meant that he was going to receive the birthright, and as the recipient of the birthright, he would get a double portion. So therefore, he gave his portions to his sons. But when you come into the land of Israel and they're dividing this up, we need to know why they were the ancestors of these people. And this is why. Not only that, because Judah was willing to give his own life in place of his brothers for the sake of his father, he was richly rewarded. And his reward was the Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah. In other words, he would be one of his descendants. Look at Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 10. We're jumping ahead here if you don't mind. Judah, your brothers will praise you. You will grasp your enemies by the neck. All your relatives will bow before you. Judah, my son, is a young lion that has finished eating its prey. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness who dares to rouse him. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, the one whom all nations will honor. And who is that? The Messiah. So now you understand how the children of Israel, a.k.a. Jacob, came to be God's chosen people. And you also know why the Messiah was supposed to come from the tribe of Judah. Is everyone with me? Good. Because now you know more than most pastors do. I'm not trying to be arrogant, but it amazes me how many pastors don't know why the children of God were named after these men. They have no idea why the Messiah was supposed to come from the tribe of Judah. And yet Genesis devotes this entire section to the story of Joseph. And the majority of pastors think that Joseph was kind of being mean to his brothers, that he was toying with them. Not at all. People, these tests were inspired by God to prove whether or not they were worthy to be the ancestors of God's chosen people. Now, let's see how Joseph revealed his true identity. Look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 45. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. Now, every time I read this story, I'm amazed at how well Joseph maintained his composure. Just think about it. Joseph had been separated from his family for over 22 years. And the last time that he had seen Benjamin, he was just a toddler. Not only that, but Joseph had risen to the position of the vizier. He was the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And if he wanted to exact vengeance upon his brothers for what they had done to him, he had the power and the authority to do it. And to top it off, his brothers have now come before him. They don't even know who he is, and they desperately need what he had just to survive. Oh, how the tables had turned. But throughout the whole ordeal, in other words, throughout these tests, Joseph had remained for the most part calm, cool, and collected. There were a few moments when his feelings overwhelmed him, but no one ever saw that because he was able to hide it along with his identity. But when he saw his brother's love for Benjamin and Judah's willingness to trade places with him, to sacrifice his entire life for his youngest brother, his emotions overwhelmed him. And it was just too much for him. But he held on just long enough to command all of his attendants to leave the room. And as soon as they left, he broke down. And he started sobbing uncontrollably. And through those sobs, he revealed who he was. Now, it sounds like, as you're reading through this, that he actually revealed who he was and then he broke down. But actually, as you read this in the original Hebrew, he has broken down and he's wailing and he's trying to get out. "I am Joseph, the brother you sold into slavery." Now, according to verse 2, he wept so loud that everyone in his palace could hear him. And because he was the vizier, the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, his attendants had a special link to the attendants in Pharaoh's house. In fact, if you go back and you study the culture and you study the history of Egypt, because he was the vizier, his attendants would have to give a record to Pharaoh so Pharaoh knew what was going on. So every day his attendants would actually go over to Pharaoh's palace and they would explain what their master had done and what he was employing and how he was employing it. And that day they came in and Pharaoh asked them, "What do you have to report?" And they said, "Nothing, your master. It was a strange day." He is in his chamber. He's told everyone to get out except for these men, and he's sobbing uncontrollably, and we're overhearing this because he's so loud. And so word gets to Pharaoh about what has happened. Now, look at verse number 3. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" Now, the reason he asked that is because when Judah steps up, and you remember he begins to tell the story because he wants to take Benjamin's place, he talks about his father being a gray-haired man, and this will send him to his grave. And he gives the impression that he's this close to death. And so he says, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Now, I want you to underline the word stunned because that's really not a good translation. The word stunned is translated from the Hebrew word bahal, and it means panic-stricken or terrified. So when Joseph revealed himself as Joseph, the brother they had sold into slavery, they were panic-stricken. They were terrified. Because remember, he had always kept his composure in front of them, and it was as if he was toying with them and playing with them. And when he seated them to eat with them, he was able to do it from the oldest to the youngest, and they thought it was because of his powers. But now that he's revealed himself, who is this man? And they're terrified. And that's why they couldn't speak. Fear gripped their heart. And all they could think of was, what's Joseph going to do to us? So Joseph had to reassure them that he wasn't angry with them and that he wasn't going to get even with them for what they had done, even though it was in his power to do so. So let's see how Joseph reassured his brothers that it was okay. Look at verses 4 through 7. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." Now, why does he say that? Is he trying to actually get them to feel more guilty? No. Because he could claim to be their brother, but when he said, "whom you sold into slavery," it's like, no one knows that. We've never told anyone. It's a secret we've all kept, and we thought we were going to take it to his grave. This has to be Joseph. Only he would know. So he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance." So to reassure them that he wasn't going to exact vengeance upon them, he told them, "Don't beat yourself up because you sold me into slavery. No, for God used what you did to bring about good. In other words, what you intended for evil, God turned into good. And now I'm in a position to not only save you, but to save your posterity on this earth." Now, look back at verse number 7, and I want you to underline the word posterity because Joseph understands his purpose now. He understands why God has brought him to this place in this time. The word posterity, look at that. "And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by great deliverance." Now, the word posterity is translated from the Hebrew word she'ereth, and it means future generations. So I want you to notice what Joseph is telling them. "And God sent me to Egypt years before all of this to put me in a position to not only save your life, but to save the future generations that will come from you." People, that's impressive because Joseph was looking at the big picture and the good that was happening and was going to happen. Now, let me ask you a question. Why do you think Joseph could forgive his brother so easily and move on? Does anyone know? Well, the reason he was able to forgive them so easily was because he chose to focus on what God had done through the whole ordeal rather than what he had suffered. And most of us aren't willing to do that. Most of us want to focus on what we're going through or what we're suffering at the time and not on what God is doing in the midst of our trials. But Joseph had trained himself to focus on God and what he was doing rather on what he was suffering at the time. Think about it. Joseph had remained faithful to God through thick and thin. He continued to focus on God no matter where he was or what was happening to him. And because of that, he was able to see God's hand upon his life. So by the time he got to this point, he realized that God had used every evil thing that had happened to him to bring about good. Now, let me make something very clear. It wasn't God's will for all of the evil things that happened to Joseph to happen. But God used what was meant for evil to bring about good in Joseph's life. And that's what Joseph chose to focus on. And for that reason, he was able to see God's providential hand upon his life, which made it a whole lot easier to forgive his brothers for what they had put him through. Because, hey, look at the good that's come out of this. I know you didn't have the right heart. I know you were jealous of me. I know you wanted to kill me, but instead you sold me into slavery. But look what God did in the midst of it. You see, when you look at things through God's eyes, The things that happen to us are kind of trivial, especially when we see them through the scope of eternity. In other words, what you've done to me or what others have done to me is really quite trivial when I looked at them through the scope of eternity. In fact, it just seems so small when I look at what God is doing and has done through the situation. And that's why Joseph could forgive his brothers so easily. When he looked at what God had done in his life and the good things that had come out of it, what his brothers had done seemed so trivial. It really didn't matter. Hey, you meant this for evil, but all the way and through every situation, God turned it into something good. Now, people, that's the type of attitude and mentality that we're supposed to have as Christians. So what that someone stabbed me in the back? So what that someone hurt my feelings? When I look at it from the scope of eternity and what's really important, those things seem so trivial, especially when I choose not to focus on it, but instead I choose to focus on what God's done and what He's doing in the middle of it. You know, sometimes it just seems so big that they said something snippy or they talked behind our back. It seems so big that they did something underhanded to us. But let's be honest. In the scope of eternity, when we're looking at what God is doing, come on, that's so trivial. And now I look at what Joseph was put through, and he had the ability to look at this and say, I know what you did, but I want you to understand, God's hand was upon me all the time, and every time something evil came upon me, God would use that to benefit me and to move me into a better position. So Joseph reassured his brothers that he wasn't angry at them and he wasn't going to exact vengeance upon them because he saw what God had done through the situation and what God was going to do. Remember the word posterity. What God was going to do in the future through the situation. Now, look at verse 8, and let me show you how this affected his perspective and how it should affect our perspective. All right? So it was God who sent me here. Notice what Joseph is saying. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And He is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. Now, people, that's the right mentality and the right attitude. Joseph saw everything through God's eyes and what he was doing and going to do. Now, I can tell you right up front that Calvinists tend to jump on this and to say that God caused all of the evil things that happened to Joseph to happen. And they claim that God caused Joseph's brothers to do what they did because this is all part of His plan. So it wasn't their fault. But people, that's not true. I don't believe that. And I don't believe that that's what that's saying. I believe that Joseph was simply recognizing that no matter what happens, God can and will work through the situation to bring about good. And when a person sees things from that perspective, they recognize that God's hand is not only on the situation and at work, but it's on their life. So when they look back on their life, they're able to see God in everything. Not doing the evil things that happen, but working in the situation. Now, when it came to Joseph and his situation, God was working when he was sold into slavery. And if Joseph chose to focus on God, then God would use the situation and He would turn it into something good, and that's what happened. God was working when Joseph was falsely accused of assaulting Potiphar's wife. And if he chose to focus on God, then God would turn it into something good, and that's exactly what He did by using Pharaoh's cupbearer and cook. God was working when Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. He was the one that enabled him to be able to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams and to be able to give him wise counsel. God was working when he was placed in the position of vizier. So when Joseph looked back on his life, wow, look at what God did. It wasn't me. It wasn't the great things that I did. It was God. And when we look at things the way that Joseph did, it can look like God caused everything to happen that did happen. Because look at the outcome. He was working in and through the situation. And look at the result. It's as if, now listen to me, it's as if God caused everything to happen that did happen, but he didn't. It just looks that way from a human's perspective. Now, let me bring something up, and this is where a lot of scholars can make mistakes early on in their career. And this is where pastors make mistakes. When you're reading a story and the person is talking in first person, it doesn't mean that everything that comes out of his mouth is right. Some of the things that came out of Saul's mouth wasn't right. Samuel, David. But you need to remember that in the Bible, when it's telling a story, it's telling you the story. It's telling you what that person thought, whether it was right or wrong. But when the author of the book speaks forth, then it's from God. Now you need to understand, they're telling Joseph's story. And Joseph is trying to assure them. And so what he does is he said, God did this to me. But the reason he did that is because when he looked back on his life, it was as if God caused everything to happen that did happen, but he didn't. It just looked that way from a human perspective. Let me give an example that I see happen many times. I've seen people come and they're just devastated because they lost their job. And they come in and they go, I don't understand God. I lost my job, and I thought this was what he wanted for me in my life. And so I said, well, let's pray about this. You know, things can happen, but God can turn things for our good. So I'll pray with them, and 2-3 weeks later, they get a better job. And you know, they come back to me and say, you know what? God was in that. That was God who caused me to lose my job so I could get this better job. No, wait a minute. From your perspective, because you're looking at the outcome and you got a better job and you realize God did this, all of a sudden you've not only given him credit for what he has done, but you've also given him credit for the bad. Wait a minute. Stop right there. That's not necessarily true. Now, Joseph is looking back on his life and he sees where this bad thing happened, but he's looking at the outcome. And he's looking how God's hand has been upon him all the way through. He gets sold into slavery, and voila, he's sold to Potiphar, who's the captain of the guard, right-hand man. There's no vizier at this time, so he's like this with Pharaoh. And he begins to work his charm. He uses his wisdom, and Potiphar realizes what a blessed person he is. He says, I need to elevate him to be the steward of my household. And so immediately he's being blessed. In fact, he's in a wealthier position than he would have been in the sheep tents at home. But then he gets falsely accused. He goes into the prison. But then look who he meets, and he's brought before Pharaoh. So as he begins to look at it, he goes, wait a minute. Man, God's hand's been upon my life all the way. It's as if God caused all of this. But here's what I want you to understand. Sometimes we mistakenly believe that the evil was caused by God. And people, the book of James tells us that nothing evil comes from God. That's the book of James. So we don't blame God for the evil. We just recognize and realize that what was meant for evil for us, if we keep our focus on God, we keep our faith, and we believe and we're obedient, God will turn what was meant for evil into good. Now, that's good teaching. But that's why Joseph told his brothers, don't worry about it, because God used what you did. And he used it to bring me to this point in history, that I might not only save your life, but also the future generations that will come from you. Because Joseph understood that God was doing something great. One of the reasons that he was chosen by his father to be the recipient of the birthright, one of the reasons that he was given the blessing, was because Jacob realized that he had a deeper understanding of spiritual things. And he realized that God had called his grandfather Abraham, or actually his great-grandfather Abraham, and his grandfather Isaac, and his father Jacob. And he believed that it was going to come through him. So now when he's in this position and they're coming down, he realizes that they have proved themselves, his brothers, worthy to be the ancestors of God's chosen people. And he realizes that God has put him in this position for a reason. And through them, he's able to save the future generations that will become God's chosen people. Now, look at verses 9 through 13. Now hurry back to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt. So come down to me immediately. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and everything you own. I will take care of you, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise you, your household, and all your animals will starve. Then Joseph added, look, you can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that I really am Joseph. Look closely. You'll recognize me. Go tell my father of my honored position here in Egypt. Describe for him everything you have seen, and then bring my father here quickly. Now, Joseph is a natural-born leader, and he knows how to delegate. Notice how quickly he goes from sobbing and revealing himself to all of a sudden he just kind of back into this position of authority and delegation. So he orders his brothers to hurry back to their father to tell him about him and who he is. Hurry, chop, chop. Tell him everything that you've seen and bring him here. And you can all live in the region of Goshen. Now, Goshen was located in the eastern part of the Nile Delta. And it was perfect for grazing flocks of animals. Wonderful grass there, but it wasn't good for farming because it flooded too easily, even in the seasons where it wasn't supposed to flood. But that's also why the Egyptians didn't live there, even though it was a part of Egypt. Remember, Egypt means what? Black dirt. So when the Nile flooded, it would bring all of this silt, all of this great topsoil, this black dirt from Ethiopia and from Sudan. And it would bring it and would go all the way to the Mediterranean. But when it got close to the Mediterranean, of course, you had this delta. It branched off into 7 different little tributaries that came in. Well, the east side of that was known as Goshen. It wasn't good for farming, but it was great for cattle, for flocks, for grazing them. Now, here's what you need to understand. The Egyptians were farmers, but they looked down on shepherds. Look at Genesis chapter 46. We're going to jump ahead, verses number 31 through 34. Here's what Joseph tells his father and his brothers. And Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's entire family, I will go to Pharaoh and tell him, my brothers and my father's entire family have come to me from the land of Canaan. These men are shepherds, and they raise livestock, not crops. They have brought with them their flocks and herds and everything they own. Then he said, when Pharaoh calls for you and he asks you about your occupation, you must tell him, we, your servants, have raised livestock all of our lives, as our ancestors have always done. When you tell him this, he will let you live here in the region of Goshen. Why? For the Egyptians despise shepherds. They despised them. They looked down upon them. So that's why it was okay for Joseph's family to live in the area or the region of Goshen. It wasn't good for farming, but it was great for grazing flocks, so they could graze their flocks there without competing with the Egyptians. The Egyptians would not get upset that these strange Hebrews, these people from Canaan, who were so unsanitary. They grow long beards and they have long hair down to their shoulders. They don't shave their entire body. They don't use the oils that we do. They don't dress like we do. They're uncouth. They are shepherds. But they won't look at you, or they won't think that you're competing with them because they don't live up there. It's not good for farming. It's only good for shepherding. Plus, you won't be living among them, so they won't look down on you for being shepherds. So this was a win-win situation for them. Now, here's what's funny. Joseph, at this point, finally got his old job back. If you remember, 22 years earlier, his job was to oversee the welfare of his father's household. That's why he was given the coat of many colors. It signified that he'd been chosen to receive the birthright, which meant that he would be the head of the family. And he was faithfully fulfilling his duties when his brothers sold him into slavery. But here he is 22 years later, overseeing once again the family, or his family's welfare, his household. He's back in his old position. And not one of his brothers has a problem with it. It's understood now that Joseph is the head of the family and he will receive the birthright. And who would he pass it down to? Who did Joseph pass the birthright down to? Actually, Jacob did it. Anyone remember? Ephraim. That's why the tribe of Ephraim, as you're going through the Old Testament, is always the most prestigious, and it's the dominant tribe. In fact, when we get to the book of Judges, and I'm not saying that we're doing a book study through the book of Judges, but I'm just saying as you're reading through the book of Judges, many times the tribe of Ephraim gets upset because they weren't included. They weren't part of the decision making. And here's what's interesting. All of the other tribes try to appease the tribe of Ephraim. And if you don't understand why, it's confusing. What's the big deal? It's because Ephraim received the birthright, which meant that his tribe would be the most prestigious and the most dominant. So as you're reading through the Old Testament, and even in the prophets, they will talk about Ephraim. Why? Because the birthright was passed from Joseph to Ephraim. Look at Genesis chapter 48. We're going to read verses 13 through 20. Jump ahead just a little bit. Then he positioned the boys in front of Jacob. Now you need to understand what's happening. Let me just kind of paint the picture here. Jacob's about to die. Joseph hears about this. And Jacob says, I want you to bring your boys. So he brings Ephraim and Manasseh. Now who's the oldest? Manasseh. All right, so he brings them. And Jacob says, bring them here. And Joseph brings them down, and he's kneeling them before them because Jacob's going to give them a blessing. So here we pick it up. Then he positioned the boys in front of Jacob. With his right hand, he directed Ephraim toward Jacob's left hand. So if I'm standing this way and I guide with my right hand, and Jacob is sitting here, he's going to receive him to his left hand. Everyone with me? And the left hand is not the dominant hand. The right hand is the hand of power. It symbolizes power. All right? So, with his right hand, he directed Ephraim toward Jacob's left hand. And with his left hand, he put Manasseh at Jacob's right hand, the dominant hand, the one that symbolized strength and power. But Jacob crossed his arms as he reached out to lay his hands on the boys' heads. He put his right hand on the head of Ephraim, though he was the younger boy, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, though he was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, may the God before whom my grandfather Abraham and my father Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this very day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they preserve my name and the names of Abraham and Isaac, and may their descendants multiply greatly throughout the earth. Now let's go further. But Joseph was upset when he saw that his father placed his right hand on Ephraim's head. So Joseph lifted it to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head, thinking, the old man can't see, he's blind. No, my father said, he said, this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head. But his father refused. I know, my son, I know, he replied. Manasseh will also become a great people, but his younger brother will become even greater, and his descendants will become a multitude of nations. So Jacob blessed the boys that day with this blessing. The people of Israel will use your names when they give a blessing. They will say, may God make you as prosperous as Ephraim and Manasseh. In this way, Jacob put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Now remember, the birthright's been given to Joseph. We've already seen that. We're going to see that again as we get a little further, get to 48 and 49. But here's what's interesting. Jacob comes along and he says, you don't need it, Joseph. But the blessing and the birthright's coming through you, so your sons now will have to receive the blessing and the birthright, and he chooses Ephraim. So, here's what I want you to see. Joseph is right back where he started in respect to his family. He's the head. And the dreams that he had years before, and the dreams that he shared with his brothers and even his father have all come true. Now, I would have liked to have finished this chapter, but I know I can't. And I also realize that I got to break it somewhere. But if I continue on, I won't be able to break it where I want to break it. So we're going to stop right here tonight, and then we'll just pick up where we left off next time. But here's what I want you to see. And this is the attitude we need to have. We need to have what I call the Joseph attitude, the Joseph mentality. We need to so believe that no matter what happens to us, that God can and will work in that situation. And with faith, we need to believe that he is working and he will do wonderful things. He'll take all the things that were meant for evil and he'll turn it into good. And as you get older and look back on your life, you'll see how God has just blessed you, and it's been like boom, 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 boom. And where it looked like it was a setback, God used it for good. And when it looked like it was a setback, God used it for good. And then all of a sudden, because when you look at it from this perspective, it will seem, from the human's perspective, you know, God must have caused all this to happen. And it wasn't that God caused the evil. It's that God caused what was meant for evil to turn into good. And when we have that mentality, God does mighty things. Lisa and I were talking about this. I was telling her as we were coming in how hard this was going to be to explain. And I was thinking about all of the times in my life when I went into the ministry where I thought I was experiencing a setback, and I just couldn't understand. And I would come out and I would whine to God, and God would speak to me and say, well, you just need to buck it up and stand. You don't understand everything. And so, boy, I would just buck it up, and I'd begin to pray. And you know what? God would always bring something better. And even when there was a setback, and I know God didn't cause it, he would turn it into good. And so when I look at it, if I'm not careful and I don't understand the doctrines of God, I will look at it and I will think that God caused all of it, even the evil, when he didn't. It's just that God turned that which was meant for evil into good. But it can seem like from our perspective that, oh man, he caused everything to happen. No. He just turned it into good. So it seems like God caused it to happen.